Hi, my name is Rachel Lloyd, and I'm the founder and president of GEMS, Girls Educational and Mentoring Services. I founded GEMS in 1998. I came to the U.S. in 1997, originally working as a missionary with adult women coming out of the sex industry. I grew up in England. I grew up in a home where, for a few years I had a lot of support from my single mother, and we were, incredibly poor. You don't realize that then when you're a kid, but when you look back, you realize, that you were actually really, really struggling. But, I had support from my mother and my grandmother. My mother married a man when I was 10, and that changed everything. He was abusive, he was an alcoholic, and it didn't take long before my mother was drinking very, very heavily. And so, when you grow up in a home with rampant, hardcore alcoholism, I mean, it changes, and domestic violence, it completely changes, how you see yourself, how you see adults, how you see the world. And so by 13, I dropped out of school. I was working full-time in restaurants and factories. I worked at a variety of factories in my town, and I grew up in a town, Portsmouth, that has a really high unemployment rate and an incredibly high poverty rate, a high teen pregnancy rate. I mean, it's not an ideal town for any young person to grow up in. And so, the environmental factors in my community, in the city, and what was happening to young people at that time where I was growing up, combined with the family dynamics of violence and alcoholism and all kinds of insanity that was happening at home, just really put me kind of on that high-risk path. I can remember our family GP telling me when I was about 14 maybe, that by the time I was 16, I would be pregnant, in jail, on drugs, or dead, or a combination of the four. And so, right, I mean, I was fairly quickly identified as one of those kids who, whose life trajectory was going to be, filled with bad statistics and problems, and that my future was pretty well predetermined in terms of it being a failure and having a lot of bad things happen in the future. I was meeting guys who were adult men. I was 13, 14, dating men in their 20s, 30s, and you think at the time that you're ready for that, and that you're mature and you know what you're doing. And then you look back as an adult and you realize how vulnerable you were and how much these men around you took real advantage of the fact you were a child. I ended up leaving England. I'd already left home by the time I was about 13. Yeah, I left England when I was 17, just in search of something better. I'd met some girls in a pub one night, and they said they were going to Germany, and there was jobs, and it was great, and you could make money, and our town and our country had hit a really bad recession at that time, and I was trying to get away from yet another awful boyfriend. And so I got on a bus, and which led to a ferry, which led to another 10 buses, and ended up in Munich in Germany. And within the first few weeks realized that I didn't have any of the skills, i.e. speaking German, which was kind of really important in that country, that were going to help me get a job. And so probably 3 weeks in, completely broke and no way to get back. I'd gotten a one-way ticket in my infinite wisdom as a teenager. And so I went and applied for a job at a bar. And I'd been told that girls could just, drink with the customers. And I know it was a strip club, but I figured if I didn't dance and I didn't take my clothes off, all I had to do was drink with the customers. And I learned really quickly that first day that there was a lot more to it. And I was able to pay for the bed and breakfast that I was staying in and not get kicked out. And so, I figured if I just, gritted my teeth and managed to get through for a few weeks, I could, get another ticket back home and forget any of this had ever happened. And I think there's a line that you cross when you enter the commercial sex industry, particularly for those of us who've been sexually abused, who've experienced sexual assault, which I had at, various ages, multiple times growing up, and then particularly as a teenager. And so you begin to think, well, this has been, taken from me. I haven't had any choice in the matter. I've been, completely sexualized and objectified and exploited already. At least this time I'm getting paid for it. At least this time I get to say, there's a line from Pretty Woman where she says, I get to say when, I get to say how, I get to say how much. And there's this false sense of control that comes, I think, in those initial kind of weeks and months in the commercial sex industry, where you begin to believe that you are operating from a place of control, where you believe that this is who you are, this is what you're destined for because of all the experiences that have led up to this and that have taught you that your body doesn't have value, you don't have value, your only value comes from your sexuality, all the lessons that you've learned as a child come into play. And I mean, it's no mistake that, 70 to 90%, I mean, there's numerous studies about this, 70 to 90% of both adults and children who end up in the sex industry were sexually abused prior to recruitment. Because it really is, and Andrea Dworkin once said that incest is boot camp for prostitution. So there really is like that kind of grooming period where you begin to believe that this is who you are. And so it wasn't long before I met a guy, which is how most stories both begin and end. I met a man who was my boyfriend initially, who I loved very much, and who fairly quickly began to tell me that, initially it was he needed to borrow some money, and then not long in, it became very clear that that wasn't like an optional thing, and that if I didn't give him money, there would be violence at the end of it, that I had to come home, turn over my money. He was using crack at the time, which I also didn't realize. And so, that relationship very, very quickly turned incredibly violent, and I felt trapped. I made arrangements for my body to be shipped home to England because I was absolutely convinced that I was going to die at, I think at that point, 18. I'd left a key for somebody because if I don't come to work at the strip club for a few days, it'll be him. His way to contact my mother. I mean, I was resigned to the idea that my life was going to be over that year. And miraculously, obviously, it wasn't. And I managed to get out, and that story is far too long and complicated. But I mean, essentially, I came into contact with a church that was on an American military base. I'd gone to a funeral and met a woman, and she kind of just kept reaching out. And I didn't have anybody reaching out to me at that time. I didn't have anybody who was showing me any kind of kindness or love. And, my pimp tried to kill me multiple times. And each time it was kind of, again, a miracle that I survived. And so I got out with the help of a church, and I got a job as a nanny. And was incredibly traumatized for the first kind of year, and didn't know it was PTSD, and didn't know what all the nightmares and the kind of daytime nightmares and all of the things that were happening to me. I didn't have a context for that. I didn't tell anybody other than I had an abusive boyfriend. I didn't tell anybody about the sex industry. I didn't tell anybody about the pimping and the exploitation and and all the things that I'd gone through, because I knew that people would judge me. And so, you know, while there was a lot of support in the church for kind of, right, the basics, and right, they gave me clothes and they gave me food and they gave me a job, and as a nanny I had somewhere to live, but I still had this big piece of me that was kind of hidden, and that I was continually struggling with kind of the after effects of the trauma. So, you know, when I created GEMS, it was really about how do we support girls in the ways that I did get from the church, right? A community, the practical stuff, employment, clothes, etc. But how do I also make sure that they have the things that I didn't have? Somebody to relate to, somebody who can say, it's all right, I've been there too. Somebody to say, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You know, you've been taken advantage of. Here's why you were so vulnerable in the first place. Here's all the risk factors that played into making you, you know, so incredibly vulnerable. And what you're experiencing is PTSD and trauma bonding and all of those things, and an environment that would really address that. So, you know, I think my experiences are just obviously my individual experiences, and one person's story is never, you know, a representation of an entire issue. But there are many pieces of my story that are very, very similar to many of the girls and young women that we serve and that we see around the country. To get out, to be free, and you know, and the freedom that we talk about a lot in the anti-trafficking movement is tough, right? There are struggles when you get out, but if you can push through that piece, if you can push through those first couple of years of struggling and the shame, and there is something on the other side of it. And you get to that point and you think, I would never, ever go back. Not in a million years, not for $1 million. That's not what I deserve anymore. And so I'm really proud of being able to kind of both role model that and to have created a community. I'm more proud of that, frankly, to have created a community of incredibly strong survivor leaders, of women and girls who are kicking ass and taking names, and, you know, are able to show the girls who are kind of growing up in GEMS that there is hope on the other side.